Okay, so I just feel the need to finally talk about a book. It has moved me so much that I think I just need to process it. I don't know. I don't know what's going on. So I'm here right now to discuss a book that I finished today that has left me completely hungover. And I don't know if I can even recommend it. Before I jump into that, though, if you're watching this and you like books and you like listening to people talk about books and hearing their impressions about them, please consider liking and subscribing to this little itty bitty baby channel. I'm really just here for the community. I don't think any of this is monetized. I don't know how YouTube works. So, yeah, I just appreciate getting to know you. So, my name is Genevieve. I am a tattoo collector, a horror enthusiast, and I read a shit ton of books. And so today I'm going to be talking about Hanya Yanagihara's To Paradise. First of all, I just want to say that I was inspired to read this book by a few different podcasts, some friends of this channel, one of which is Renee from Book Talk, etc., which is such a cool podcast. You should definitely go check those ladies out, Tina and Renee. I look forward to their chats every week. They're two mood readers in the Midwest, which is very adjacent to where I am. So, and they talked a lot about Hanya Yanagihara and specifically enjoying A Little Life. And when I found out that she was coming out with a new book, I was curious. I have not read A Little Life. I don't think I will be reading that book. I'll be completely honest. I looked into it. I even read a synopsis of the plot online and determined that it's a little rough for me. And I'm just not going to go there. Maybe one day. Maybe one day I'll read it. But for right now, it's just not high on my priority list. But I was curious about To Paradise because the plot just sounds so curious. And I'm going to get into the basics, and then I will be spoiling this book towards the end, but I will tell you when I'm about to do that. So for the first part, no spoilers, just going to give you a primer of what to expect, because I think that that's the thing with this book. People don't really know what to expect. And yeah, I don't see a lot. I actually Googled like interviews and to learn more about it. And if anything, it's more just people comparing it to A Little Life. And you're not going to get that here because I didn't read A Little Life. So I'm just going to be talking about this book. And I think for me, that was the best way going into this. It seems as if there's a lot of pressure on her to kind of recreate the intensity of A Little Life. And I have no idea whether or not this book lives up to that. So you're not going to get any information from me about that there. One thing I do want to say before I get into the plot, however, is that Renee was talking about getting her copy of A Little Life signed by Hanya Yanagihara and was sort of surprised at how the execution of the signature was. And so when I finished this book, I read it first on Kindle, and then I switched to audio because I've been playing a lot of video games and I like to listen to audiobooks while I play video games because, spoiler alert, I actually don't like a lot of the stories in video games and I don't really want to sit there and watch the movies in those video games, so I just listen to books the whole time. It's great. I love it. So I finished this book today while I was really close to a bookstore, and I was like, I think I need to buy this book. I think I need a physical copy of it. I walk into a bookstore and I see it sitting on the shelf, and I notice that they only have signed copies. And I wasn't really looking for a signed copy after hearing Renee talk about her experience getting one. Basically, her signature is a little basic. So I went, I was like, well, I want the book, so I'm going to buy it anyway. And I grab it, I walk up to the checkout, and I was like, word on the street is she has a really not great signature, basically. And I was like, do you mind if I look at it before I buy it? And the clerk was like, sure, fine. So I open up and I look at the signature. I was like, yep, checks out, and then completed my purchase. To show you what I'm referring to. It's just like a little basic squiggle. I don't know if you can even really see it that well. There we go. That's probably, yeah. It's a little surprising. I mean, here's the thing. I just want to say, sign it however you want to sign it. Live your life. Like, I get it. You probably sign a lot of books. I have a really long name myself. And so I understand, like, not wanting to do that. I think in her situation, however, I probably would just get a nice stamp and just stamp it, or like do my initials. But do you, like, I don't want to sound ungrateful. I'm really happy that I own this book, a physical copy of it. All right, now let's get into this book. So To Paradise is basically 3 novels inside of one novel. Each of the 3 books are connected, but not in a way that if you're somebody that's really looking for like this epic storyline with a bright thread all the way through and resolution of a previous storyline in a later storyline, you're not going to get that here. That's not what this is. I think of the elements that repeat themselves within the book more as echoes. They're echoes of the other timelines in these timelines. This is a speculative fiction in a lot of ways, and also an alternate reality book. So again, there's 3 separate books. One timeline is in the 1890s, another timeline is in the 1990s, and then the 3rd book starts in the 2090s. I'm looking at the book right now. And then each part goes back in time a little bit less. So like, for instance, so this is again, the whole 3rd book starts in the 2090s, and then goes 50 years previously, then goes back to 2094, and then goes back 40 years, then back to 2094, then back 30 years, et cetera, et cetera. So, and it's 2 people that are connected, and it's sort of like a dual timeline, essentially, for just that 3rd book. So if you're not confused yet, then it's going to get even more confusing. So like I said, the 1st book, it reads more like a Eaton Wharton novel. And I kind of feel like I'm giving 3 book reviews in one. That's really what this feels like. The 1st book is like an Eaton Wharton novel. It takes place in the 1890s in New York City. And one of the echoing elements of this book is a house in Washington Square Park. I have been to Washington Square Park. I can't conceive of what this house kind of looks like. I just sort of think of it like, again, Eaton Wharton novel, like sort of not a brownstone, but like a fancy house. In New York. I'm really just giving you my basic impressions. I'm not an expert on any of this stuff. I'm just a reader. So there's that. And it centers around a man named David who is afflicted. I would say probably today we would say that he's probably bipolar, again, I'm not a clinician, so he clearly has some issues with anxiety, but he also exhibits some really odd behaviors that make life challenging for him. But he is the heir to this fortune in banking, right? He's a Bingham. And so the Binghams have this vast fortune. He has 2 siblings, but he lives in a world where essentially the South has seceded from the Union, or the South never really became part of the Union. They're their own sort of thing. And he lives in what is called the Free States, which kind of presents itself as being this better, progressive, more economically solvent counterpart to the rest of the United States. Texas, it's implied. Now, here's the thing. This book doesn't get deep into these politics. It talks a little bit about them, but it's not like a major part of this. And Hanya Yanagihara does this amazing job of world building so that you have like a general understanding of what's going on, but it's not like a fantasy novel where you're like, it's super important to know about lore or anything like that. But this book does kind of have lore. Like, it's a literary fiction, speculative fiction that has lore. It's kind of wild. This really is its own thing. And I feel like it's made just for me in a lot of ways because I'm kind of living for all of it. So it's this alternate universe. And essentially, like, this heir really doesn't have much to do. And I think this is the thing that built tension for me, is that he is entering the marriage market. But it sounds like he feels compelled to do that. It sounds like he doesn't really know what he wants to do. I think we would maybe call him like a failure to launch in a lot of ways, like today, where he's not really capable of holding down a job, but he also doesn't really need to, but feels like he doesn't have a place and sort of feels like he's living within the shadow of his wealthy family. And so he goes on to the marriage market, and it's really about him figuring out sort of what the future moving forward is going to be for him. I think that sets it up nicely without really getting into it. I will say that for it sounding really kind of simple, and it is kind of a simple plot, for the 1st book in particular, I got really anxious and it was really intense for me at one point. I actually wound up spoiling the end of the first book for myself because I was up like early in the morning. First thing I usually do in the morning when I get up to let my dog out is I'll just open up my book and start reading. And I was like, I can't even go back to sleep. I'll let the dog out at like 5 a.m. And I was like, it's now 6:30 and I'm still up and I'm still reading and I'm still freaking out. I think if I'm going to calm down, I just need to know what happens in the end. And then I'll figure out how we got there because I'm too anxious about it. And I'll get into that in the spoiler territory as to why that happened to me. So that's the first book. And I've heard in reviews of this book that people preferred the first one. I will get to how I feel about the ranking of the 3 books within this later, but I do think myself, at first I was like, no, I totally see why people feel that way. It's really good, and it is really good, but I actually kind of prefer the 3rd book over the first. So then we go into the second one that's 100 years in the future. Again, the house in Washington Square Park is referred to, but then also you start to notice that names are repeated. So there is a David in this, there is a Charles in this, and they're not related. They're sort of related, but they're not related. Tangentially related, but not really. There's also a Peter, and just all of these different characters that had reference in Eden is another name that's referred to more than once throughout the thing. Just echoes of these names, and the characters are very different from one another. It's not as if it continues a storyline from the first book. And so David is a young man in his 20s. He's a paralegal at a law firm, and he's in a relationship with a man named Charles who is sick. And it's about living in New York during the AIDS crisis and this relationship between a man. First, it's an interracial relationship. He's Hawaiian, and it kind of talks a little bit about his background in this as well that plays a lot into the story. And Charles is white, but also Charles is much older and has a lot more money than David does. And so there's that aspect as well. Book 2 is also divided into 2 parts, whereas book 1 is more traditional. It's like chapter. Book 2 is like 2 big, long parts. And by that point, I'd switched to audio. And I'm glad I did for those 2 parts. I think those were better over audio because the way that this story is told, you're very much inside of these characters' heads. And I don't know, it just felt... it felt better listening to this as if it were not necessarily stream of conscience, but as if I'm being told this story. And also she gets into sort of monologuing and like epistolary style writing. So I think that lends itself really well to audio. That's just my personal preference. So the first part is about David living in New York with Charles. And then the second part is told from David's father's perspective. And that is probably the most challenging aspect of this book. It is very long. David's father is really he reminds me a lot of the David from the first book. He seems to really struggle both emotionally and physically. And I don't know, it was, there were parts of that story in particular that, where I would get frustrated with the David in part 1. I got even more frustrated with the father in part 2. But at the same time, Hanya Yanagihara does this amazing thing where even though you know that this character is going to fail you, at the same time you want, or at least I really wanted to know what more was going to happen. Like I'm looking at the audio and I'm like, okay, there's this much more left and this much has happened. Like what more could happen considering the stakes that have sort of been raised here? And when I say stakes, I don't mean this is not a big action-y book, right? It's extremely internal and thoughtful. But the world that's described is incredible. I did actually learn a lot about Hawaii, and these 2 characters are part of the Hawaiian royal family, and so I learned a little bit more about that. I've read a little bit about that, but not enough. And this made me realize I have a lot more to learn, right? So really fascinating and epically sad. So I guess that's kind of in line with what people talk about when they talk about A Little Life. Now, the third book I'm going to describe, and then I'll go into spoiler territory. The third book takes place 100 years on from the story of the 90s. And what was interesting is that, so the first book has this alternate universe and where actually homosexuality is like legal and accepted in the New York of the 1890s. It sounded more in the 1990s, the second book, like it was more like today, but and references to the other countries and sort of the structure of the American government weren't really mentioned that I remember. So the second book kind of sounded more like they refer to the civil rights movement, they refer to the Vietnam War. Like it's more familiar to our timeline. The third book is 100 years further and is a dystopia in New York City, and it's full on dystopia. So if you were looking for a super dystopic book, I feel like that's about 40 to 45% of this chunky boy here. And it was absolutely my favorite part. It's told from the perspective of a virologist whose name is Charles, and his granddaughter named Charlie. And it goes back and forth between their two perspectives. And basically, the structure is that Charlie introduces you, the female Charlie introduces you to this dystopic world and kind of sets up the stakes of that world. Like, essentially, we live in, like, think of the Soviet Union times like a million in New York City. And the house on Washington Square is now apartments. And then we jump to Charles' perspective, and that is all completely epistolary. So he's writing to someone else. And that jumps back 50 years from Charlie's timeline. So Charlie to Charles. So I should say granddaughter to grandfather. Yeah. So we go to the grandfather's timeline, and he would be, I feel like, a young Gen Zer. If, like, just thinking about the time that he talks about, like, meeting his, so he'd probably be about 20 years younger than me, I feel like, roughly. That makes sense. Yeah. So he, and it's really just about his, like, I don't want to say involvement, but, like, him watching the world become what his granddaughter sees. And I think that's what I liked about it, is that, like, that itself could have just been its own book, honestly. I don't think we necessarily, quote, needed the first and second parts. I liked the first and second parts, but they, and again, there's echoes in the third part to the second and first. But I felt like with part three, it was just this own kind of perfect speculative fiction novel. With Charles, the grandfather, I need to just say grandfather. I keep referring to their names because that's what they use throughout the whole thing. But through grandfather's timeline, we kind of watch how this dystopic future happens. And by the end, everything kind of catches up, and we fill in a bunch of blanks as to why the granddaughter lives the way that she does. And we learn a little bit more about her struggles and sort of how she came to have even just the perspective that she does, I guess. She speaks with a particular cadence that you learn why, right? So that's basically this book. That's what, like, I hope that gives you, like, a general idea of what to expect, like, when you go into this. It's about 720 pages. I'm sure it could have been cut down. Like, I don't think any book needs to be that long, but I mean, that's just my general feeling. But I'm kind of glad it was. And I think the most successful aspects of this were really how Hanya Yanagihara builds character, how she, just the way that she writes a sentence, the way that she builds worlds, the way that she communicates ideas, I just think is really skillfully done. And I could not stop reading this book. The only reason I really switched to the audio was because I was struggling to find the time to finish it. And so I was like, I just need to, listen to some Hanya Yanagihara book and play some video games and, combine my time there. Now I'm going to get into spoilers for this book. So if you don't want to know anything about this book more than what I've already said, which I really just kind of set up the stakes, but now we're going to talk about payoffs, whatever that means in this book, because I think that's different from other people's everybody's expectations vary when it comes to stakes. So go away and then come back after you've read it. And then please, let's talk about it in the comments. I need to talk about this book. So, first of all, again, this was a 5-star read for me. I don't know actually if I mentioned that. Yeah, this was a 5-star read for me. Even though it was long, even though it was very challenging at times, there's something about this book I think that is, I don't know, it exceeded any and all expectations I had for it, and it also made me feel a way that no other book really ever has. I felt so connected to each of these characters, and in a way that it felt real almost. It's hard to describe. I don't know. It just, especially the end of the third book, it just devastated me. And it's one of those books like that. It just kind of slaps you in the face by the end, and you're like, wow, okay. So each of these stories are about a person looking for paradise and moving on towards and defining for themselves what paradise is. That is what this book is all about. So David, in the beginning, he is sort of negotiating a marriage with an older man named Charles, but he meets a younger man named Edward, who is poor, he's from the colonies, and they are basically the southern states, and then there's uncharted territory out west, including California, Oregon, Washington. The West is also referred to as like the Western Union. So, yeah, and then you have the American Union. Yeah, so, and again, I read this whole book and like didn't really need to know all of that stuff. Like they really just talk about the free states a lot and just sort of why they're better, etc. And you do get the sense that like for them thinking that they're so hot shit, there's still racism, and there's still the same sort of level of contempt for lower class people as well, and immigration issues that there are if the Union was united as one, right? So there's that tension, and that tension is kind of reflected in both Edward and in David's relationship, right? So David is clearly very naive and very sheltered, and what was making me so anxious is that clearly he had a sexual attraction to Edward and a romantic attraction to him that was being reciprocated. But then you're confronted with the reality that Edward is probably a grifter. You're confronted with evidence that he has done some terrible things and is clearly just using David for his money, because David's going to come into a sum of money after he turns a specific, I think it's like 30 or something like that. And it's clear that he's being taken advantage of. And his grandfather, that was what was stressing me out. So this is his grandfather who's taking care of him and has taken care of him, has only ever wanted what's best for him, set up this marriage for him to Charles. And Charles is a cool guy, like for the time and considering things. I was rooting for him to marry Charles, who it seemed like he was a widower and he just wanted to have another companion and was okay with even David going out and having relationships with other people. But for some reason, David became obsessed with Edward, even though he was confronted with evidence that Edward is a bad dude, and just ignored all of that. And it's clear so Edward approaches him to go out to California, and it's clear that he kind of agrees to that, but it's not explicitly stated. So you're kind of left with like, well, did David make this mistake and go out west? He probably did, and probably lived to regret that, but you never find out. And I remember just like what made me anxious. I was like, why are you making these bad choices? Like, this is a terrible choice. It's clearly a really terrible choice. And I don't know if that's supposed to matter, right? Like, I think that that's the point of that first book, is that it's living in this uncertainty, even though as the reader, it's such a clear choice. And yet, I just felt bad for David. I have not pitied a character like that in a really long time. So that was the first book. And each of the ends of each book like ends with the words to paradise, which I thought was really kind of cool. So he buggers off to California. Then you start book 2, where you have different David, and he has the last name Bingham. So you assume that he's somehow related. And he references that his last name comes from missionaries, Hawaiian missionaries, well, I should say California missionaries that came to Hawaii. And his story deals a lot with colonization and annexation of Hawaii, of being the descendant of royalty in Hawaii, but also living in New York City. And the thing that really left an impression with me in his story in particular was how far away from home he was, and being confronted with navigating life in New York City, which he did well and successfully. I think he's probably the most successful character in this whole book. And then when you get into his father's part, you realize like the challenges that his father kind of gave to him that were really horrific and intense. And I don't know, it makes him seem even more amazing that he was able to overcome those things. I'm not going to talk too much about book 2 because not a whole lot happens in it. Basically, it's about his life with Charles, and it kind of skips forward a little bit, or it's referenced in the future that, he does eventually take on Charles' estate. He stays with him until Charles dies, and it's the best relationship he ever had. But it's also about the complications of their kind of May-December romance, and sort of where David goes in his life and the things he sort of achieves and comes to term with. He also, I think, now correct me if I'm wrong, okay? Because if you read this and I'm wrong, let me know. But this is how I read it. I believe that his children are the then old, one of them is one of the old men in the couple in part 3, I think. Or at least there's an echo of that name, the name Aubrey. So the name Aubrey is mentioned. It comes up in book 2 and is again in book 3. And also the name Peter shows up in book 2 and is referenced again in book 3. So that was book 2. Again, the father's part, really it's just his background, and he clearly also struggled with seizures and other some behavior disorder as well, behavioral health challenges, and eventually essentially becomes homeless with his friend Edward. Basically, if your name is Edward in this book, you're an asshole. Like, Edwards are bad, Davids are complicated, Edens are fringe female characters. Like, it's just really kind of fascinating. I really want to reread this book and just like make a chart of like how each of the different characters, like, does having the name Edward, it seems like always means you're a jerk, right? It's like, that's what the echo is for. It's like to signal like who this person is within a play. And that's kind of how I'm thinking about this book now, is like a play. Is it a play in 3 acts, and almost like, a Tom Stoppard-esque, like, or David Mamet kind of play. Like, it just, yeah, it's very conceptual, I guess. So now into book 3, which is my favorite. And again, by this point I was with audio, but I did actually go back and reread sections because I was like, I just want to like take it all in. And I do think specifically when I reread this book, I'm going to focus really in on book 3 because there's a lot of detail and a lot more world building. It is about essentially the collapse of New York and into a dystopic future. It's implied that New Britain is sort of the better, thriving, surviving, less or kind of has it more together country. I don't think any other countries are mentioned. Really, it's just New York and then there. And so now the areas are broken up into zones. And so they live in zone 8, and that's where Greenwich Village is, and where the house in Washington Square is. And basically Charlie, oh my gosh, her story was just so wild. Okay, I need to collect my thoughts for a second. Okay, so we're introduced to Charlie first, and she describes living in the apartment that is now like the divided house of at Washington Square with a husband, and sort of the rules. And it reminds me a lot of like, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? Or even Fahrenheit 451, where like the relationships between people are kind of, they feel stilted and different. And you realize that like she's married, but she doesn't, and I don't think at first you get the impression that her husband is just not very close to her, and you don't really know why. So then you go to her grandfather, Dr. Charles, and he is writing to a man named Peter that he is friends with. And clearly, like, they're about mid-career to the end of his life. this ends with his execution. Literally, it's wild. Okay, I'm just gonna try to hit the bullet points because otherwise I would sit here and talk about this book forever. All right, so he is a doctor of virology and he works in a laboratory called Rockefeller University, and Hanya Yanagihara basically builds out. And she started writing this in 2017, so it's not a pandemic a reaction to the pandemic, but so much of what happens in it is so familiar to us right now. And so if you are somebody who can't read about pandemic shit, do not read this book because it will fuck you up. And essentially he studies how these viruses kind of get out of control and basically sets up what other people have said about, the difference between a threatening and a non-threatening virus is just containment, right? Like any virus can be horrifically threatening. So there's all of that. He moves with his husband and Nathaniel and their baby boy named David from Hawaii to New York. And that kind of starts everything off. And he's working at this university studying viruses. And Nathaniel is clearly like unhappy about this move and trying to find his place. And then he winds up meeting people, these two older men that live in the Washington Square Park house. So we know that at this point that Charlie is living in that house in her future, but in the past, the Grandpa Charles is just living in New York and is now met the people that live in that house. And so basically the rest of the story is how out of control pandemics get. And he is a part of a group of scientists and other people that eventually put into place what becomes a dystopian future. And then he is used as a fall guy and is then assassinated by that government or executed by that government in the end. That is his whole story arc. But he has these long swaths where you slowly watch his marriage break up. You slowly watch his son become disillusioned with the government and clearly also has behavioral issues that never really fully get addressed. And in these letters that he's writing to Peter, because it's all told through letters that he's writing to this man named Peter, who's clearly some sort of government official in some other country or diplomat or something and lives in New Britain. It's clear that his life is falling apart very, very, very slowly. And that really built a lot of tension for me and it freaked me out. And by the end of it, I was like, oh my God. And then Charlie's story takes up after he has been killed. And he explains her illness. Like she had an illness as a child that she now has an affected affect, like the way she interacts with people, and clearly a neurological disorder based on taking a medication for an illness that she had. So she is married to a man who is gay. It is now legal to be gay because basically the government is forcing everybody to be in relationships in order to procreate because nobody wanted to have children because all these viruses were happening and the world was sort of melting and nobody wanted to, like the birth rates just sunk. So now they live in this like government controlled zone where they have coupons and all these restrictions. There's no internet anymore. There's no television anymore. There's only a radio and it's all like government sponsored radio. And they get coupons and rations for food and clothing and everything else. And they are forced to they have marriage brokers again and they're forced to get married. Her husband is gay and he has a secret relationship with a man who lives in, they basically go and they visit these houses that are essentially places where people can go be themselves, or like private houses that people then go and be with their loved ones because they can't otherwise. And she meets somebody named David that is going to help her escape. And the book 3 ends with her on that trip to get out. And it's implied that something unexpected happens and another boat finds her boat as she's fleeing to go to Iceland. And it just ends with her looking up at the person that's trying to talk to her. And that's the end of the book. So that's it. Dr. Charles ends with his execution and him saying like, I did everything I could. And I hope that when I come back, in my next life that I'm like essentially like a bat and I can fly over all my loved ones and make sure they're okay. And granddaughter Charlie's whole storyline ends with maybe she was intercepted by police, maybe or by the government and taken in, maybe she wasn't, we don't know. Maybe it was just the next length of the journey. Because in the way that Hanya Yanagihara does it, Charlie's story ends first, and then Dr. Charles ends second. And it's kind of implied that he begged Peter to do something to help his granddaughter. So, yeah, it's very Children of Men. Actually, it's like super Children of Men, except like instead of people not being able to have children, they don't want to have children. They're being forced to have children. And there's also like forced sterilization in this world too. It's really intense. There's way more that I could go into, but I'm not going to do that. I think I'm done. That is the full on experience with this book. Again, like I said, I gave it 5 stars. It's really different from anything I've ever read. It's really, again, the way that she pulls you into this world, the way that people's humanity just shines through, even if you don't agree with the things that they're saying. Like Dr. Charles in the 3rd book, like he was a selfish, put his job first, not very good person. And yet at the same time, I was rooting for him the whole time and just wanted to know more about this world that he was living in and how he was dealing with it, how he was dealing with his son. His ex-husband, he becomes an ex-husband, and his son winds up being killed. And so that's why he takes full custody of Charlie and kind of sets up her life to hopefully be better. And there's these passages that just are so relatable to today. Like that he talks specifically about, and I think this is very prescient today, considering what's happening in the world and what's been happening in the world for the past decade, of like, when do things get so bad that you should leave? And that whole passage where he talks about like, should I have gotten out of New York when I could? Why did I stay? And he kept saying, oh, well, I'm, this important virologist, like they still need me if I'm still, and this idea of being needed, and being important, and then having that ripped away at the end. That's definitely a theme throughout each of the books as well. Each of the like main characters within the book like have to find their place in the world and come to terms with sort of how other people value them and if they value them and what that means to them. And it's just really fascinating. I definitely will be rereading this book. I think this is something that every time you go back to it, you're going to find more. But it's also really tough. It's pretty rough as far as the dystopian bits. There isn't a lot of violence outside of that. No, there's not a lot of violence outside of that, which I think is, if that's something you're concerned about, something to think about. And I mean, that's basically it. So if you like this, you know what to do. The YouTube thing, likey, subscribey, blah, blah, blah. And I want to do more of these. I was hoping to review every single book that I've read this year, but I cannot devote time. I've read over 40 books already, so I don't want to do a separate video for every single one. So I'm thinking of doing like batches. I don't know. Let me know what you think. How should I do that? Because I'd like to review more books, but I also don't. And when I say review, I mean give my impressions. I'm not a professional reviewer. But yeah, how would you like that? Would you mind if I talked about 3 or 4 or 5 books in one, or talked about a group that really worked for me, a group that really didn't work for me, maybe something like that. So, all right.